I want you to kinetoscope it.
No technology in the discussion of technology. That's good.
I was going to say fantasy and science fiction, yes, but now C.C. Finley's taken over. He takes electronics, so my whole typing it out on a typewriter and sending it in.
Well, I'll go ahead and kick it off
Sure.
as a semi-moderator. Welcome to the Writing and Technology panel. I will, if that's what you're here for, then great. If not, too late. Why don't we go ahead and...
This chamber has no windows and no doors, which presents you with this chilling challenge to find a way out. Of course, there's always my way. Sorry, I had a haunted mansion.
Does it involve a toothpick?
That's
No,
okay.
I grew up in Florida. I know exactly.
Good man.
So let's start with introductions. We'll start on that end and we'll come back this way.
My name's Lou Berger. I'm a Denver-based writer. I write short stories, and I'm in the process, a long process, of finally writing a novel that's been in my head for a couple years.
Cory Doctorow, and I write science fiction.
I'm Josh Vogt. I'm a fantasy author, and my 2 debut novels are coming out in May. And I also freelance write full-time for a wide variety of clients. All right, so technology, good or bad?
Yes.
I'm for it. So I use some. I have a not a love-hate relationship with technology. I have a complicated relationship with technology. So a lot of my professional work, both in science fiction and out of it, is attuned to the unintended consequences of technology, or the way that technology fails, or how to design technology that fails gracefully, and what kind of technology policy produces graceful failures versus bad ones. And then in my own life, because I'm a former systems administrator and CIO, I am really keenly attuned to trying to design my life so that when my technology fails, it's not a disaster. Like, that's kind of my major preoccupation, is knowing that my technology will fail, how to make it not a disaster. So I have a lot of backups and so on. But one of the things that I have always done is archive my papers with the library in Toronto, where I grew up, called the Merrill Collection. It was founded by Judith Merrill, who's a great science fiction writer and editor and critic. And they archived lots of writers' papers. And one day the chief librarian there, Lorna Toulis, said to me, it's such a pity, in the old days, we would get discrete drafts from the writers whose papers we archived. We would get the first draft, the second draft, the third draft, and so on, right up to publication. Now the book is just a digital file that's sort of fluid right up to the moment that it becomes a printed object. And it's such a pity there's just no way to keep track of changes to a text. And I was like, you know that keeping track of changes to a text is like the canonical solved problem in computer science, that like everything else we do, we can do because we can keep track of changes to text files, which is to say software, right? And everything else rests on that. So I have a friend, Thomas Gideon in DC, who's a Git hacker and a Python hacker. And Git is an environment for saving changes and tracking changes to big program files. You may have heard of GitHub, which is a hosted version of Git. So Thomas wrote me a set of scripts called Flashbake that are now open source and on GitHub. And what they do is every 15 minutes they look at all of my working files and they check in all the changes to them to this version tracker, and then they consult my IP address to figure out where in the world I am. They look up where the weather is, what the weather is where I am. They look at the last 3 things I posted to Boing Boing and the last 3 songs I've listened to. And so for virtually every word I've written, I have this for the last several books. I now have this, right? What was I listening to? What was I thinking about? Where was I? What was the weather like? And I don't know that it'll ever be of any use, but it feels to me like, if at one point scholars were interested in seeing discrete drafts, well, I'm going to give them a discrete draft to end all discrete drafts. Right? I'm going to give them phrase by phrase. And lately, now that I have lots more storage on my laptop, I've been thinking there's not really any reason not to capture every keystroke. And while you're capturing every keystroke, not to capture a photo. And while you're capturing a photo, not to infer pulse rate from the infrared range of the webcam, because you can do that by looking at your carotid. And also not to grab skin galvanometry off of the trackpad. So you could really get sort of an enormous amount of endocrinological and metabolic information, as well as a picture, most of which would look like, but for every single keystroke and backspace. there, and I've contemplated it. It feels, even if I stipulate that no one will see it until after I'm dead, it still feels a bit invasive.
Well, I mean, you can always do the biofeedback route, where you find the biological state you're in where you're most productive, and then force yourself into that state.
So stipulating that there is a state in which you're most productive, I think it's probably situational and related both to the thing you're writing and the other things in your life.
Sure.
So I don't imagine that there is like a one true way to be productive. I think it's a homeostatic process that involves kind of a bunch of adaptive processes in your brain and what's going on in the book and what's going on in the external world.
The galvanometric response could be used as a reverse engineer to figure out where your heart rate was at the lowest. You could cut those, excise those parts that are being boring, and only string together the things where your heart rate was up.
Yeah. What about you, Lou? Do you have any particular, does technology play a big part in your writing process? Is it a big fact? Do you even think about it? Or is
I'm
it just
probably doing it wrong, but I store everything in Dropbox.
Yeah.
And so I keep working drafts in Dropbox, and there is automatic version control, so I can go back to, I already guess, however many as I haven't had to yet. But I can start working on the manuscript at home and go to work and bring it up at work and pick up right where I left off.
I'm telling you, boss.
You should.
Yeah, I do a lot of the same thing. It's mostly for, right now, it's data backup. It's also for, well, I do a lot of freelance work as well as a writer, so I monitor my time. I track how much, it helps me create timesheets for clients. It helps me make sure that I meet my deadlines, the Google alerts, and all that sort of stuff. I also use it for automation in my author platform with social media and that sort of thing. Technology is a big part there, just as far as being able to not have to, if I'm involved in a dozen different social networks, they're all linked. So I can plug one and it proliferates to all the rest of them, so it saves me a lot of time. So for me, technology is a big time saver and a security device. I don't do as much the biofeedback route of it, or the data gathering of what's going on around me at the time, but it is much more of a safety net, and it also kind of acts as my administrative assistant, because I am very bad at the billing and the invoicing and the calendar elements, so it kind of takes away that chunk of my brain and lets me use that processing elements for the work itself.
So another critical element of the way that I use technology is, for a long time now, I've only used text files for my work, so just TXT, ASCII, and I feel like the longevity of those files is pretty much guaranteed. It's not hard to convert them to other things. I use Markdown, which is a really simplified way of marking up a manuscript so that it's human readable. It's things like asterisks for italics and so on. But there are loads of scripts that will then turn your Markdown into HTML or OpenDoc or whatever, so that it can be submitted to people who aren't as comfortable with text. But I really like the simplicity of working in a text editor. It has virtually no features. Yeah. And I use the default text editor that comes with Ubuntu. It's got Emacs key bindings and it has a word count. And that's the whole lot, basically.
Well, you mentioned simplicity, so that's another topic. The technology, a lot of people talk about how technology is such a distraction these days. And with writing, if you're constantly distracted, you're not getting the writing done. So, and starting with Lou, does the social media, does technology in and of itself, is it distracting to you? Do you have to make a concerted effort to shut it off to get any progress done, or is it always on and you just have to learn to manage?
Neither. I'm actually the worst of the bunch. I use technology as a convenient crutch to social media and whatnot to not write. It gives me a valid reason not to write. Work, emails, texting somebody, messengering back and forth, even writer friends, they're the worst. They're always willing to talk instead of writing.
Ready to commiserate.
Ready to not write themselves. So that
yeah, I can't get anything done. Me neither. Let's chat.
That's what George Bush called writing-related program activity. Mission accomplished.
Right.
What about you, Cory? How do you deal with distraction? Aside from the TXT.
Right. So I kind of I burned out on ceremony. So there was a long time when I wrote where I was really consciously trying to figure out how to kind of coax the muse into the room. And I read all the books that said, you should burn scented candles. You should have a deck of cards with random ideas that you stare at for 10 minutes beforehand, and you should whatever. And I started really selling books in earnest while I was doing a very demanding job. I was traveling 27 days a month. I was in 31 countries in 3 years. I was the European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I was all over the place. And I just couldn't woo the muse into the room. And so I dispensed with all the ceremony. That was kind of the most important thing I learned, was to dispense with all the ceremony. And so instead, I put the focus on doing a very small amount of work, but doing it every day. So when I was traveling that much, it was 1 page a day, 250 words every day, 7 days a week. It only takes about 20 minutes. So you only have to manage your distraction for about 20 minutes. And then the remainder of the time is yours. And rewrites are another question and so on. But being able to kind of limit myself to these very short periods and being with the work every day meant that I had some continuity and also that I could stave off distraction. If there's one piece of advice I wish I hadn't ignored for so long, it's to write every day, because habits are things you get for free.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of use technology to stave off technology distraction. I am very much a social media whore. That's because I work from home. That's how I get my sense of connection with other people throughout the week and all that, except for when I come to conventions. So when I am invested in a project, I have to turn that all off. But at the same time, because I freelance, I can't entirely turn it off, because if a client has an emergency, I need to be able to respond. So I actually have 2 programs that I use. One is called Freedom, and one is called the Antisocial. So depending on the situation, I will use one or the other. Freedom actually cuts off my entire internet connection for up to 8 hours. And if I turn that on, the only way that I can turn it off, obviously never been an issue for you.
Never.
No.
Well, it's like they say, writers, it's not coming up with the ideas, it's picking which idea to work with, which is the one that they have legs to it.
Right.
So yeah, the Dropbox thing is probably not as secure as I would hope for it to be, but it's text files.
Sure.
It's doc files. I don't care. I haven't lost anything until I do. I'm pretty happy with that solution.
Cory, have you ever had to deal with, since you have so many books out, how many books do you have at this point?
About 20, including the 2 that are coming out in 2016.
Okay. So my guess is that you probably have experienced piracy in some degree.
Well,
Does that
all of my
matter?
works are available as free downloads under Creative Commons.
Okay, that's right.
So, but what I have experienced is people preparing commercial editions and putting them in the Kindle store. But it's just a quick email to my agent. And I don't expect that they've sold it.
You should have been on our copyright and plagiarism panel. Right?
Yeah, my head might have exploded. But yeah, the reality is that I don't expect that those editions sold in the copies. I think that what they were is someone went and scraped a bunch of ebook sites and then bulk uploaded all of those files to Amazon. And I wasn't obviously not the first one to notice them, because they had done thousands of them, and I wasn't the first one to complain, and within moments it was taken down. It wasn't that big a deal. It's not a thing I worry about over much. I am of the school that I'm way more interested in making sure that everyone who wants to read can read my books, so that everyone who's willing to pay can pay, as opposed to making sure that everyone who reads has to pay first. And so and that strategy's done well by me. I haven't really worried about piracy at all.
Sure.
I worry about other things. There's a Taiwanese edition of one of my books coming out where they've inserted their own introduction in Chinese, and I'm trying to figure out if it's, conforms to observable reality. And so I'm trying to find someone who both speaks Chinese and isn't a domain expert in copyright law.
To make sure they don't change the meaning.
To make sure that it conforms to, the message that I'd like to have carried in the book.
Do you have any particular, you obviously haven't dealt with any privacy issues. Do you have any particular tools that help you write more on the go? Like, you hear things like people who wrote an entire novel on their mobile phone, or riding the subway or things like that. Do you have tablets or things like that you take with you while you travel?
I used to have a ergonomic little keyboard. It was USB and wireless, and I loved that. But anymore, I just take a laptop. No, I don't have great answers. It's a great question.
I feel like writing on a phone, it's like a preview of what my life will be like after my stroke. I go from 70 words a minute to 10, and I become aphasic because of autocomplete. travel with my laptop. I often walk around with my laptop typing on it. One of the major technological shifts that I made that's incredibly banal but made a huge difference in my life was I switched to ThinkPads. I was a long-time Mac user. I have an old Mac tattoo on my arm. I used to, when I was a CIO, I wrote $1 million PO for Mac equipment every year. And not only did I get sick and tired of this whole control freakery thing, but when I switched to Linux on ThinkPads, I realized that there's this global warranty that they offer, $50 a year, and it includes next day on-site global hardware replacement, where they will come to your hotel and fix your laptop on your desk. And I've had laptops fixed in Mumbai, and I've had them fixed in London and New York, and everywhere that IBM Global Services is, for a mere $50 a year, which makes AppleCare look like a form of ritual abuse. And keeping my machine going is kind of the alpha and omega of my life. So it made a huge difference.
You don't do any handwriting in this?
No, you can see my chicken scratches. My dad was a computer science teacher. We had keyboards in the house from 1977 on. I never really learned to handwrite. I continue not to be able to handwrite.
You handwrite them?
Not at all.
No.
My hand cramps after a single page.
Same here.
Joe Haldeman writes by hand.
Yeah.
He fills these beautiful notebooks with his amazing handwriting.
So you guys don't do any like outlines, sketches, journal ideas,
By
anything
hand?
by hand?
No.
No.
Nothing?
I will like scratch on a napkin if I have nothing else to do, like just like, elephant has a gun, something like that, and then I hope I know what that means later on.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know.
I email it to myself.
I text to myself.
You text to yourself,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I open a new document and save it in Word. I have a template, a blank manuscript. I save it in Dropbox, and then I change the title, save it, and then any changes to that. I'll just type a synopsis, if it's a short story, a page or two, and then save it, and then go back and build the story from the sentences and the synopsis.
So Bruce Sterling told me that after he finished the book, I think it was probably the Caryatids, he was moving from LA to Texas, or Texas to LA, and he was driving back and forth. I think he did 2 or 3 trips, and he strapped his laptop into the passenger seat and had his laptop text-to-speech his whole novel to him while he went to listen for infelicities in the language and other typos, and just, I guess, pulled over. I hope pulled over. He's my daughter's godfather. I don't want him to die, but pulled over whenever there was something to be said there.
Yeah, I've heard that that's a really good technique because it lacks the human inflection elements. You just hear whether it's actually
A human reading it will fix some problems on it.
Yeah, they can smooth it out. One of the tools that I've used, and I'm working on it as well, but Kevin J. Anderson is dictation. The voice to transcription, and he uses, he just records it on an audio recorder, and he has a dedicated transcriber. For me, I use the Dragon Naturally Speaking software, which has worked relatively well. You have to train it and that sort of thing, and it has to get used to your vocabulary and your voice and that sort of stuff. But I have found that if I just get into the flow of it, I can write by speaking very quickly. It has accuracy issues, and there's a lot of cleanup on the back end, but it's just another way that if I'm driving, to Florida for 8 hours in the car, I can just clip the microphone on, and
That's
and
intense.
yeah, well, yeah. So
I'm totally Amish for QWERTY.
yeah. So I mean, I prefer right now typing, and I'm a pretty fast typer. But when I'm there, when I can't type, that can kind of keep me feeling productive.
Do you feel like it comes out pretty much the same way?
No. Absolutely not. It's very different mental flow, because when when I'm typing, I kind of patchwork it, and I don't do it chronologically. So when I'm writing, when I'm dictating, I'm trying to do it chronologically, so that when it because then I have to save it as an audio file and then plug it in and process it through the Dragon audio version, which is different than if I was just speaking directly to Dragon. So it's a little bit you have different modes, but it is. I'll listen to myself, and there's like a 5-minute long pause, and then I'll start speaking again, that sort of thing. But it's interesting. I think it makes my mind work in different ways. Excuse me. Yeah. But like Kevin, he will write 2 or 3 chapters a day, just by that process. And
Yeah,
that's how he does 6 or 7 novels a year.
I could do the same thing. It just would be 2 or 3 chapters in drag.
Yeah, well, no, and he's been doing it for like 30 years now. So he's, that's why you have to get used to it. It would be like taking a QWERTY to a Dvorak or whatever.
Dvorak.
Dvorak, you know, where he rearranged the letters so that they're supposedly more ergonomical or efficient. And you would have to spend 6 months relearning how to type, you know, from
So,
scratch.
Sue Townsend is one of my favorite writers who wrote the Adrian Mole books. When she went blind because of diabetes, she began dictating her books. And you know, I hope that if that ever happened, I could do it. I can't imagine it. It feels just so foreign to how I write. Justine Larbalestier, the Australian writer, has very bad nerve problems, and basically failed to switch to dictation, and now just basically doesn't answer email, so that the few keystrokes she can key in every day, she devotes to her fiction. And I think it works well for her, but it's tough.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, there's something amazing that happens when you write, which is related to what happens when you read, which is this thing where you read about imaginary people whose lives are by definition irrelevant because they're not real, and yet you have this limbic response where you cry and you
Useful today, but what would be the consequences of it? I haven't as yet unfinished, see previous notes. Story, a murder mystery set on a floating barge out in the Sargasso Sea, where it's enormous. It's the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it's nothing but seaweed gathering to create algal biofuel. And it's an enormous, production, and basically the doldrums, where the waves and the storms and whatnot don't come through, and there's nothing but sunlight all the time. It doesn't get in the way of shipping lanes or anything, and it's the unintended consequences are they have a monopoly on the world's energy. It's simply cheaper to pull your tanker up and fill it up in the ocean than it is to drill it out of the ground. And it's carbon sequestering. So the fact that it's carbon sequestering eliminates what we have going on with fossil fuels and allows for the first time a shift back from the heat.
Right.
That's 100 years in the future is pretty significant.
I always try to imagine technology as something that is neither the master of humans nor has been mastered by humans, right? Where there's this complex dynamic of push and pushback. And this is also kind of my activist view as well. You know, the internet, the way that we conceive of it today, is the world's most perfect surveillance device, but the internet also gives us access to cryptography and to the capacity to organize with one another in a way that is absolutely new on the earth. The people who say that there's nothing new on the earth have never seen us being able to build something as complicated as an encyclopedia with all the organizational infrastructure that you bring to a bake sale. That is, I mean, the project of our species, right? The thing where we stop being proto-hominids and start being things that look like humans is when we start dividing labor, right? We start figuring out how to do things that transcend the limits of an individual. And the internet has made it possible in some domains to transcend the limits of individuals in ways that are truly amazing. And so, you know, one of my cheap tricks, if you ever want to do something futuristic, if you ever want to do a futuristic move, take something big and complicated and make it work like Wikipedia. Building skyscrapers, controlling an aviation system, running a local government, running a national government, you know, running a space program, and basically anything where you dispense with rigid hierarchy for a kind of dialogue and argument and collective labor and reverts and whatnot, I think is a futuristic thing. I'm aware of and wary of the fact that we can really only predict a few orders of the effects, and generally we miss the big ones. Gardner Dozois, the editor, has this very famous quote that the job of a science fiction writer is to imagine the car and the cinema, invent the drive-in, and predict the sexual revolution. But what Gardner missed is that, you know, now looking on the sexual revolution 50 years later, was that the sexual revolution being tied to the car meant that for the first time in the history of America, teenagers had a good reason to carry government-issued ID, which was that you couldn't get laid without it. And as a consequence, we now live in the database state, right? You know, it's hard to think of, but imagine an American society in which no one had a piece of identification, right? Like much of what we think of as our modern infrastructure crumbles without that basis for identifying yourself. And really the reason that people bought into it en masse was the opportunity to go to the drive-in and get laid. So I'm really, I am always aware that when I write science fiction, I predict the present, not the future. and that I'm mired in my own biases and my own inability to see past the next hill. And so I don't make the pretense to being able to predict the future. Science fiction writers who think they can predict the future are like drug dealers who sample their product. It never ends well.
Yeah. Most of my science fiction work has been short stories, and when I write the technological elements, it's usually, I try not to, I see so many writers do it in a way that it's just a nifty idea, and then they just build a story around the nifty idea of, you know, the what if technology could do this, or what if we had this device, or that sort of thing. And I feel it's important to make it more than a MacGuffin to drive the story, to make it more than something that just, you know, it's the Maltese Falcon that all the characters are running around trying to get. It's integrated. It's integrated in their lives, in their emotions. It's kind of the unintended consequences. Like if you introduce a new piece of technology, you don't know how it's going to impact the economy. You don't know how it's going to impact privacy. You don't know how it's going to impact religion. You don't know how it's going to, and so trying to see all those modes where it could potentially be weaving through society and characters' lives, and then trying to bring out the more conflicting and contrasting elements of that into the stories is kind of my approach to it. But yeah.
So the internet provides the homogenization of culture, world culture, and it dissolves the political bands, the limits that divided us as separate countries.
Which internet do you use? The internet I use is full of like bizarre Rule 34 subcultures and ISIS.
Well, like Twitter and Arab Spring, and how people were, the Arab Spring was short-lived but very intense.
Sure, but
shift towards a democratic kind of idealism.
So I agree, but the internet is full of these like tiny little subcultures that are you know are able to, you know, it's the love that dare not speak its name, right? I mean, here we are at a steampunk conference. Steampunk is this like canonically internet phenomenon in as much as people who are kinked in weird ways, you know, sort of when goths discover brown subculture, are able to find one another, right? And I think that you know that's the motif of the internet, and that while there are political ideologies that have found adherents all across the world, where, you know, people have been able to reach out across and find other people who are like-minded. That the corollary in America of that is ISIS and Anonymous and Occupy and, you know, kind of fringe groups that can unite and be more than the sum of their parts. You know, try to imagine ISIS before the internet. It's like it's unimaginable.
Well, we've shifted. So we've shifted from political, hard-drawn geographical boundaries to ideological boundaries that transcend. So we don't fight countries anymore.
Yeah.
We fight ideologies.
Well, and you know, since the age of exploration, and at least since the post-war era and the Great Migrations, there's been a self-sorting process underway where, you know, that prefigures the internet, where people move to where they thought the values reflected what they wanted. America is full of this, of course. The New World overall is full of this, you know, religious intentional communities, and political unions, and so on.
I'm from the South, and I live here deliberately, so I know exactly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm from Canada, where we have French and English Canada, and not just Quebec, but also towns in Ontario and New Brunswick and Manitoba that are French.
We're getting close towards the end of our time. Are there any questions that have kind of been burning in the back of people's minds as we're getting near that? So one of the...
You keep looking like you're about to ask a question and then nod. So.
I do have a question. It's not exactly directly related to technology and writing, but to technology and marketing your writing. And so one of the ways, of course, to market your writing is through Facebook and social media and whatnot. And I'm wondering how you moderate your technology use so that you don't acquire people who you really don't wish to acquire, like stalkers.
Yeah.
And if you actually have methodologies for doing that, or if you're just like you deal with it when it shows up.
So step one is to be a dude, right?
Well,
I mean, this sucks, right? But step one is to be a dude. I mean, I have one stalker who's a former student of mine who's mentally disturbed, and she doesn't just stalk me. There's a lot of people she stalks. But I'm a dude, and the women I know who are in writing have a lot more of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's being very proactive about it, recognizing the moment that it's not engaging with it, because that's the thing, is technology lets you engage so easily. And it lets you, I mean, and there's the whole anonymity side of it, you know, you can hide behind, you know, all that kind of stuff, but. What's that?
James Tiptree.
Yeah. And you can do the soft puppet element where you can create multiple accounts now and start putting your own 5-star reviews while giving opponents 1-star reviews, and you know, it's just any system that's created, someone is going to try and game it, and you just have to learn to protect yourself from it in the best possible way. And because it's constantly evolving, your techniques are going to have to constantly evolve. I mean, you use the block functions on the social networks that you have, but I think those social networks just they train you to engage. And so your automatic response, the moment you get that kind of interaction, that negative interaction, is to try and